Hi, in this video I'm going to show you my homemade DIY piano. So that's the voltage of that battery that I use for the piano. After which it's been boosted up by this boost converter over here to 12 volts. Somewhere there, 12.6 volts. So now I will explain how my homemade DIY piano works. It works based on that 555 timer IC chip. Firstly, a 12 volt power supply powers up the chip. So that means there will be 4 volts at the non-inverting input of this comparator and 8 volts at the inverting input of this comparator, as well as power supply. And the reset pin of the 555 timer chip is always put high so that it won't reset externally. When any one of these keys are pressed, current from the supply, which is 12 volts, or in my case is 12.6 volts, will flow from the source down to that 1K resistor and down to that fixed resistor, which is, as you can see, is this one over here. After which current will flow through a series of trim ports. The resistance that the current will go through will vary depending on the keys that you pressed. Through the push button switch and down to the trigger pin of the IC, which will charge up the capacitor C1. Initially, the voltage across this capacitor is at 0 volts and there's no charge stored in this capacitor. So you have a 0 volts at the inverting input of this comparator over here. And of course 0 volts at the non-inverting input at that comparator over there. Because non-inverting input is higher than inverting input, it outputs a 1 and that sets the flip-flop. When the flip-flop is set, then Q bar must be 0, because logically Q will be 1 and Q bar is 0. However, there's this inverter at this output driver that will cause the output to go high. 1. So the output goes high like this. However, as the capacitor C1 gets charged up to 2/3 of the input voltage, what happens is that the non-inverting input of this comparator will tend to be higher than the inverting input, which will reset the flip-flop to, and the reset will go high and the set will be 0. So Q bar over here will be high, and if Q bar over is high, at the same time it turns on this BJT transistor over here to discharge the charge of this capacitor C1. So when capacitor C1 is discharged, current will flow from here to there through the push button switch, assuming that one of the keys are pressed. through that resistor, which is the trim port, one of the trim ports over here, and the charge of the capacitor will eventually make its way down to ground. At the same time, the output will of course be a low, because the output driver will invert the input at Q bar. So it will go low like this. And when capacitor C1 reaches about 1/3 of its supply voltage, as it discharges, there's a tendency that the voltage at the inverting input of this comparator will be lower than that of the non-inverting input of this comparator, which means that the flip-flop will set once again and the cycle repeats. So you will end up having a square wave at the output. And as for the waveform of the capacitor, we will expect a sawtooth waveform. The peak will be about 2/3 the input voltage, and the bottom over here will be about 1/3 of the input voltage, like that. So let's see the waveform across this capacitor as I play the A note. And as you can see, I'm right when I say that the waveform as probe across this capacitor C1 would look like a sawtooth wave. We can derive the formula that will determine the frequency at which the output of the 555 timer will make. So as you can see, there are 18 keys on this keyboard over here, and as you might realize, I have arranged two capacitors like this, and that switch over here is actually to switch for a different capacitance value, which will be connected in series with the loudspeaker over here. So for example, I play this note. When this switch is closed, it sounds like this. When I open that switch, it sounds a lot softer. Sounds a lot softer, just like that. So why would I do this? Is because, well, I guess I could have changed the volume of my speakers in a way, but the frequency of it will be affected also. So do bear that in mind. Next, I have come up with a list of all the different music notes. If you know music, you will know what it means by, you will know what I mean by all this, and the different frequencies that will match up with the respective music notes. And you can find all this information anywhere on Google online. To determine that value of that resistor, I'll be anyway that resistor is the overall resistance between the discharge and threshold pin. That's what it means. And you can derive the value of this resistor using one of these formula, which is simply the rearrangement of that formula. And based on the trend of the changes in resistance to produce the different music notes, I can determine that I will need a 2.2 kilo ohm trim port resistors wired up all in series, together with a 6.8K fixed resistor, which, as you can see over here, 6.8K resistor with all of the trim port wired in series. And of course, I have tuned all of the trim ports in such a way that I will get the correct frequency. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Do comment, like, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and goodbye. And it didn't sound out of tune, so I'm still happy with it, even though the frequency of the A note is not really spot on.